The Rugby Football League is a little bit different to Derek and Ian's own organisations in that we don't own our own venue, and therefore I'm going to reflect on two areas this morning before we go into the question section. One of those is our role as a regulator, and the second of those is our role in terms of hiring venues to play our central matches. And certainly, when we're looking at safety in relation to those two aspects, we see safety as very broad. It's wider than just the physical environment. It encompasses anti-terrorism, which obviously has already been references to, crowd trouble, and any other forms of antisocial behaviour. So the Rugby Football League as a regulator sees our role as being about providing education and support to the clubs and the people within the clubs who are responsible for safety, to provide clear rules around what we expect from our clubs, and when necessary, and thankfully this is relatively infrequent, ensuring that we enforce those rules. In terms of education, we keep this under review. We have a very good set of ground safety officers who meet on a regular basis, and where necessary, we provide support to that group. We've recently circulated a note to all our chief executives at clubs, reminding them of their responsibilities around safety. And the intention behind that was to provide support to the ground safety officers. It's too easy for people to think that that individual alone is responsible for safety at grounds, and that's just simply not the case. And that note was actually done following a recommendation from one of our tribunal chairs, who, after hearing a case about safety, said, you as the governing body must have a lot of know-how around what different clubs are doing to try and ensure that there isn't issues at matches. And it's important that you disseminate that information to all clubs. And so this note, it doesn't get into detail on what the ground safety officer's role is, because they'll look after that themselves. It's looking at some of the broader issues around what clubs put out on their social media prior to matches, what messages they send to fans around the behaviour that they expect of their fans, how they're selling alcohol, in what volume glasses they're selling alcohol. Building on that, we also, at the end of last year, ran a session in conjunction with the NATSCO, a Project Argos training session, which was specifically done around rugby league and rugby league stadiums. Moving then on to the rules, we have clear operational rules which set out minimum standards around stadiums and what evidence we need from clubs around complying with those standards. We then have clear rules around fan behaviour and the responsibility of clubs to ensure that their fans and anyone representing their club behaves appropriately. And then we enforce those rules where appropriate. And those rules are pretty much strict liability, which can seem very harsh, but actually it's a really clear message then to fans that if they misbehave, it impacts their club. One example we had was Castleford, where there was homophobic abuse in the ground, clearly completely unacceptable, and led to a fine of £40,000. We had an issue at the end of last season in our £1 million match, which is a playoff game, in effect to decide who's going to be in Super League in the following season and who's going to be in Championship. Again, we've recently just handed down some pretty significant financial penalties to the clubs involved to, where necessary, try and change behaviour. Moving on to our role of hiring venues. We use a number of different venues. Our Challenge Cup final is at Wembley, our grand final is at Old Trafford, and then we have our Magic Weekend, which I can only imagine must be a complete headache to the ground safety officer of whichever venue we're staging that at in any given year, given that involves all 12 Super League clubs playing a match at the same venue over one weekend, so 6 games. So I can only imagine when the ground safety officer gets told that they're hosting them, that must create some real headaches. Whilst we would never wish to overstep the mark, and clearly responsibility for safety sits with the venue, we ensure that we have a significant number of planning meetings leading up to matches, and that we develop that strong relationship to ensure that we are trying to ensure that safety is paramount, and we're feeding in all of our specific knowledge around rugby league and the teams that are involved. We also then have a crisis management group, which is made up of senior executives and board members who are attending the match and who will meet if the need occurs. Each of them is given an area of responsibility. When we first started having this crisis management group, we tried to go into lots of detail on every single possible issue that could arise at a match and set out in detail exactly who would do what when. And the reality is it's just simply not possible. We've now pared it right back to a relatively short document because we decided the key was that you had the right people in the room knowing what their area of responsibility was, and that we'd done some desktop training sessions on that previously, working through some possible examples so that people knew where their responsibilities sat. When I was reading through the session for today, the note at the bottom, in addition to talking about our role as leaders, was asked the question about how can safety professionals influence leaders? And my reflections on that really is that, again, safety initially can appear a very dry subject, and therefore trying to get the airtime and people to engage can be challenging. But I think the key bit is to sell the positives to leaders of organisations. We're all in the entertainment business, we're all in the business of selling tickets. And I think if you get the safety part right, you ultimately have a great customer experience, which then feeds into those commercial and those organisation-wide goals of building the sport.